Hi, I'm Rashonda Case. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley, and we are on chapter 15. It's the last chapter of the book. That makes it sound like we are almost finished, but no, my friends, we are not almost finished. We have, can you see it? We have like this much book left. Chapter 15 is a monster mega chapter. It's like 70 pages long. And then after that is the index, which is like 40 pages long. And when we started this thing, I said we would read the index because it's full of back and forth letters between Mrs. Keckley and various people. I flipped through every single page of chapter 15 just trying to see where it would end. So we are clearly not going to finish chapter 15 this time or the next time or even the next time, but we're going to read it. That's what we're going to do. And we're going to get started today. Chapter 15, The Secret History of Mrs. Lincoln's Wardrobe in New York. Well, that sounds interesting. In March 1967, Mrs. Lincoln wrote to me from Chicago that, as her income was insufficient to meet her expenses, she would be obliged to give up her house in the city and return to boarding. She said that she had struggled long enough to keep up appearances and that the mask must be thrown aside. I have not the means, she wrote, to meet the expenses of even a first-class boarding house and must sell out and secure cheap rooms at some place in the country. It will not be startling news to you, my dear Lizzie, to learn that I must sell a portion of my wardrobe to add to my resources so as to enable me to live decently. For you remember what I told you in Washington, as well as what you understood before you left me here in Chicago. I cannot live on $1,700 a year, and as I have many costly things which I shall never wear, I might as well turn them into money and thus add to my income and make my circumstances easier. Okay, consignment shop that stuff, and there's all sorts of online things now that you could do to sell your stuff, Poshmark and whatever else are all the things. Okay. It is humiliating to be placed in such a position, but as I am in the position, I must extricate myself as best I can. Now, Lizzie, I want to ask a favor of you. It is imperative that I should do something for my relief, and I want you to meet me in New York between the 30th of August and the 5th of September next to assist me in disposing of a portion of my wardrobe. I knew that Mrs. Lincoln's income was small and also knew that she had many valuable dresses which could be of no value to her, packed away in boxes and trunks. I was confident that she would never wear the dresses again and thought that, since her need was urgent, it would be well enough to dispose of them quietly and believed that New York was the best place to transact a delicate kind of business. She was the wife of Abraham Lincoln, the man who had done so much for my race, and I could refuse to do nothing for her calculated to advance her interests. That's interesting that she says she can refuse to do nothing for her because she is the wife or the widow of Abraham Lincoln, not because of who she is in her own right or because of the relationship that they have. I got a fuzzy in my hair. It might still be there. I don't know. It is. I'm not going to look at it. Neither are you. Or maybe you will. I don't know. But I'm going to keep reading. I consented to render Mrs. Lincoln all the assistance in my power, and many letters passed between us in regard to the best way to proceed. It was finally arranged that I should meet her in New York about the middle of September. While thinking over this question, I remembered an incident of the White House. When we were packing up to leave Washington for Chicago, she said to me one morning, "Lizzie, I may see the day when I shall be obliged to sell a portion of my wardrobe. If Congress does not do something for me, then my dresses some day may have to go to bring food into my mouth and the mouths of my children." I also remembered of Mrs. L having said to me at different times in the years of 1863 and 64 that her expensive dresses might prove of great assistance to her some day. "In what way, Mrs. Lincoln? I do not understand," I ejaculated the first time she made the remark to me. So ejaculate means the same thing as exclaim, totally not the way we use the word now. And by the way, the word meant both things. back in the day, but like even when I was little, people would say like in a like you're telling a story or something, oh, and so ejaculated thus and so. Nobody talks like that now. But I warned you a long time ago, I read what's on the page, and a lot of it is not what we would say or do today. But that's one of the great things about reading literature from different times is you hear different voices and different usages, and it's all really very cool. All right, so that was Mrs. Keckley speaking, and now Mrs. Lincoln is responding. Very simple to understand. Mr. Lincoln is so generous that he will not save anything from his salary, and I expect that we will leave the White House poorer than when we came into it. Excuse me. And should such be the case, I will have no further need for an expensive wardrobe, and it will be policy to sell it off. I thought at the time that Mrs. Lincoln was borrowing trouble from the future, and little dreamed that the event which she so dimly foreshadowed would ever come to pass. I closed my business. Mrs. Keckley opens and closes her business all the time, honestly, at the whim of white people who she loves. I am neither happy nor upset about that, but it is an observation. I closed my business about the 10th of September and made every arrangement to leave Washington on the mission proposed. On the 15th of September, I received a letter from Mrs. Lincoln, postmarked Chicago, saying that she should leave the city so as to reach New York on the night of the 17th, and directing me to precede her to the metropolis and secure rooms for her at the St. Denis Hotel in the name of Mrs. Clark, as her visit was to be incog. So incog is incognito. Why does Mrs. Keckley have to go before her and get the hotel room and everything set up? Why? I'm going to get over this. Let's keep reading. The contents of the letter were startling to me. I had never heard of the St. Denis and therefore presumed that it could not be a first class house. And I could not understand why Mrs. Lincoln should travel without protection under an assumed name. I knew that it would be impossible for me to engage rooms at a strange hotel for a person whom the proprietors knew nothing about. I could not write to Mrs. Lincoln since she would be on the road to New York before a letter could possibly reach Chicago. I could not telegraph her, for the business was of too delicate a character to be trusted to the wires that would whisper the secret to every curious operator along the line. In my embarrassment, I caught at a slender thread of hope and tried to derive consolation from it. I knew Mrs. Lincoln to be indecisive about some things, and I hoped that she might change her mind in regard to the strange program proposed, and at the last moment dispatch me to this effect. The 16th and then the 17th of September passed, and no dispatch reached me, so on the 18th I made all haste to take the train for New York. After an anxious ride, I reached the city in the evening, and when I stood alone in the streets of the great metropolis, my heart sank within me. I was in an embarrassing situation and scarcely knew how to act. I did not know where the St. Denis Hotel was and was not certain that I should find Mrs. Lincoln there after I should go to it. I walked up to Broadway and I got into a stage going uptown with the intention of keeping a close lookout for the hotel in question. A kind-looking gentleman occupied the seat next to me, and I ventured to inquire of him, "If you please, sir, can you tell me where the St. Denis Hotel is?" "Oh, yes, we ride past it in the stage. I will point it out to you when we come to it." "Thank you, sir." The stage, she's had trouble with that before. Remember when she was going to Rude Hill and like she fell asleep and passed her destination and somebody was like, "Oh, you slept right through it. Why didn't you tell me?" So I'm a little, I'm a little, I don't know, a little cautious in my spirit about her. Well, let's keep reading and see what happens. The stage rattled up the street, and after a while the gentleman looked out of the window and said, "This is the St. Denis. Do you wish to get out here?" "Thank you. Yes, sir." He pulled the strap, and the next minute I was standing on the pavement. I pulled a bell at the ladies' entrance to the hotel, and a boy coming to the door, I asked, "Is a lady by the name of Mrs. Clark stopping here? She came last night, I believe." I just got some weird interference on my audio. If you heard that, I apologize. Interesting that there is a ladies' entrance to the hotel. All right, so she asked somebody if Mrs. Clark was there, and the person replies, I do not know. I will ask at the office. And I was left alone. The boy came back and said, Yes, Mrs. Clark is here. Do you want to see her? Yes. Well, just walk around there. She is down here now. I did not know where round there exactly was, but I concluded to go forward. I stopped, however, thinking that the lady might be in the parlor with company, and pulling out a card, asked the boy to take it to her. She heard me talking and came into the hall to see herself. My dear Lizzie, I am so glad to see you, she exclaimed, coming forward and giving me her hand. I have just received your note. I had written to her that I should join her on the 18th, and have been trying to get a room for you. Your note has been here all day, but it was never delivered until tonight. Come in here until I find out about your room. And she led me into the office. The clerk, like all modern hotel clerks, was exquisitely arrayed, highly perfumed, and too self important to be obliging or even courteous. This is the woman I told you about. I want a good room for her, Mrs. Lincoln said to the clerk. We have no room for her, madam, was the pointed rejoinder. And I wonder if they didn't have a room, or they didn't have a room for a black person. Like, we have to ask these questions. But she must have a room. She is a friend of mine, and I want a room for her adjoining mine. That is a lot to ask for without having pre-made arrangements. We have no room for her on your floor. That is strange, sir. I tell you that she is a friend of mine, and I am sure you could not give a room to a more worthy person. If she wasn't traveling incognito, she might be able to name drop that she was Mrs. Lincoln, but here she's Mrs. Clark. Friend of yours or not, I tell you, we have no room for her on your floor. I can find a place for her on the 5th floor. That, sir, I presume will be a vast improvement on my room. Well, if she goes to the 5th floor, I shall go too, sir. What is good enough for her is good enough for me. Very well, madam. Shall I give you adjoining rooms and send your baggage up? I am so curious about what these rooms on the 5th floor are going to be like. Yes, and have it done in a hurry. I can't help but thinking that, like, is somebody gonna, I mean, nobody's gonna call Mrs. Lincoln a Karen. I'm not even calling Mrs. Lincoln a Karen. One, because that's rude. I don't do that. At least I try not to. I might, because sometimes we do things and we don't know that we're doing them. I learned the other day that I slap my leg when I'm laughing really hard, and for like my whole life I had no idea that I did that. But it's striking to me that right now Mrs. Lincoln is coming off as, that type of privileged, make everything happen for me woman that the Karen stereotype is about. So anyway, let's keep reading. Yes, and have it done in a hurry. Let the boy show us up. Come, Elizabeth. And Mrs. L turned from the clerk with a haughty glance, and we commenced climbing the stairs. I thought we should never reach the top, and when we did reach the 5th story, what accommodations! Little 3-cornered rooms, scantily furnished. I never expected to see the widow of President Lincoln in such dingy, humble quarters. I don't know why Mrs. Lincoln didn't see this coming. I hope she gets a discount from whatever she was paying on. Was she on the 4th floor, for whatever floor she was on? How provoking, Mrs. Lincoln exclaimed, sitting down on a chair when we had reached the top and panting from the effects of the climbing. I declare I never saw such unaccommodating people. Just to think of them sticking us away up here in the attic. I will give them a regular going over in the morning. But you forget, they do not know you, Mrs. Lincoln. I misread the punctuation there. But you forget, they do not know you. Mrs. Lincoln would be treated differently from Mrs. Clark. True, I do forget. Well, I suppose I shall have to put up with the annoyances. Why did you not come to me yesterday, Lizzie? Oh my gosh, why is she so demanding about everything all the time? This woman had to close up her whole business to come help you with this, and you're mad because she didn't come a day earlier. You're probably mad because she didn't secure your lodging. Oh my goodness, Mrs. Lincoln, I am tired of you. And for just a hot millisecond there, I sounded like Major Payne when I said, I am tired of you. Do you know the movie Major Payne with Damon Wayans? It's very funny. It is politically incorrect in every single way, but it is funny. True, I do forget. Well, I suppose I shall have to put up with the annoyances. Why did you not come to me yesterday, Lizzie? I was almost crazy when I reached here last night and found you had not arrived. I sat down and wrote you a note. I felt so badly, imploring you to come to me immediately. This note was afterwards sent to me from Washington. It reads as follows: St. Denis Hotel, Broadway, New York, Wednesday, September 17th. My dear Lizzie, I arrived here last evening in utter despair at not finding you. And the emphasis is there. It's not just me. I am frightened to death being alone here. Come, I pray you, by next train. Inquire for Mrs. Clark, room 94, fifth or sixth story. Okay, it's just like letter upon letter, some signed Mrs. Clark, some signed Mrs. Lincoln, with no sort of. Oh, this is just saying inquire for Mrs. Clark, and then the letter continues. All right, I was thinking that was the close of the letter. House so crowded could not get another spot. I wrote you especially to meet me here last evening. It makes me wild to think of being here alone. Come by next train. Again, emphasis there. Without fail, your friend, Mrs. Lincoln. I am booked, Mrs. Clark. Inquire for no other person. Come, come, come. I will pay your expenses when you arrive here. Sure, she will. I shall not leave here or change my room until you come. Your friend, ML. Do not leave this house without seeing me. Come. We're going to stop here because I'm just aggravated with Mrs. Lincoln and her demands. It's a lot for me to take in. So we're stopping right there. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda. Until next time.